You went to Manchester University for a master's degree in English literature. Did you ever think of being a poet?
To be honest, I didn't really realise it was an option when I was in college. I mean, when I was in university, it was one of those things where when you're doing English, you're often told your only path is really to become like an English teacher, or like a journalist or something like that. Which, you know, both great, but the idea of actually doing a creative career for life was really sort of never even offered.
Do you remember your first poem?
Oh God, my first poem. I think my first poem would have been, I was doing like a youth project, like a youth leadership project. And we had to do presentations at the end of it for this sort of assessment. And I decided to do mine in the form of a poem. I don't know why. I was just sort of like, that feels correct. And I just remember shaking so hard and like sweating so hard. And I actually asked the entire audience to close their eyes because I couldn't bear the idea of them looking at me. So, you know, it just goes to show that I never thought that this would be the trajectory I went down, but it definitely introduced me to something I didn't realise I had in my sort of wheelhouse.
Then a poet, what career do you think you'd be doing now?
So for a long time, I thought I was going to go down the professor route. That was why I did a master's in the first place. I thought I'm just going to go bang, 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 PhD next, like it's going to be so chill. It wasn't chill, it was very hard. And I think taking that time out of study was really important for me to realise I just had more life to experience, more of the world to see. And it's not to say I don't necessarily see myself doing that now. I'm quite passionate about black sort of communities in academics because we're very underrepresented at a professor level. I think there's only something like 40 black women professors in the UK, possibly less. When I was studying, it was about 20. So I kind of felt a responsibility to do that and sort of be a representative, because often we don't see ourselves in sort of academic spaces. And it's one of the things that really kind of makes us feel unconsidered when we go into these places. So maybe down the line, like some sort of creative writing post or some sort of sociological post, but for now I just really want to focus on creative sort of outlets, so yeah.
Will you ever do like international tours?
I'd love to. Just waiting for the offer, to be honest. I mean, a lot of it is you kind of need to develop this portfolio, I guess, and this trust with you know, whoever you're sort of working with and performing with. And I've still not released a collection of my own, for example. And so it's kind of hard for anyone to kind of take my work with them at the minute. So that's a goal for me, I think, to start, and then hopefully international opportunities follow,
Like, do you have any, like, countries or, like...
Ooh, I'd love to be in the Caribbean at some point. That's my heritage. And I think even to just maybe do, like, a residency there or something like that, spend some time just really getting in touch with my parents' culture, my grandparents' culture. I studied in Canada for a bit, and that was so much fun. I loved being there and sort of the community there. I could see myself doing something there. I also really want to learn French, so that would be a cool one, to be in France for a bit.
Do you have any situations where you experience writer's block?
Yeah, like all the time, to this day. And it is a sort of, it's like a muscle. You kind of have to exercise it for it to kind of just sustain itself. And it is often the hardest thing once you enter that writer's block to get out of it. And for me, the answer to that has been community. So finding a creative community that keeps you inspired and keeps you engaged. And sometimes the most inspiring thing you can do is just go to a poetry show, because you see someone else doing their thing and killing it, and you're like, oh my, like you take something with you, and it energizes you to write something yourself. So that's sort of how I've learned to tackle it, but it's not something I've got down to a science. I still sometimes go months at a time with nothing.
How do you feel being on stage performing?
It's an interesting one. I think when I started, it was actually my least favourite part of the process. I always thought, I used to strictly call myself a writer because I thought I'm not a performer, like that's just not in me. And it was through mentorship really that I kind of began to realise just how enjoyable the stage can be and how much it can add to something that you write. So, you know, when you write something on a page, that's between them and the reader, do you know what I mean, the words and the reader. but when you are the performer, you kind of captain the words a little bit, and you can really be very intentional in how those words land.
Yeah.
And that for me has just been really fun to explore, like realising how much you can impact your words with performance.
When you write your poems, what gives you inspiration?
So I'd say my main sources of inspiration are my heritage.
Yeah.
So I come from a Jamaican background, and within Jamaican background there's a lot of oral storytelling, and there's a lot of ghost stories and a lot of just like generational stories, and those have been just a huge source of inspiration. Like I'd say my favourite writers are just sort of like my elders, and they've given me they just have such a whimsical like way of writing and approaching life and speaking about life that it was almost bound to get into the writing.
Yeah.
Aside from that, it's in terms of like inspirations, Toni Morrison's a big one. A lot of sort of black femme writers, I would say, who kind of unashamedly sort of relate to their experience and everything like that.
What is your favorite poem? It can be a poem that you wrote, or it can be a poem from someone else.
Ooh, that's a hard question. It's a really hard question for me to answer because I find, rather than necessarily digesting poetry on the page often, I love to be at a show. I just find something about that really magical between the poet and the performer and the audience. Fave of mine is probably Island Screams still, which is the one I entered into Slamavision, just because I feel like it's the first time I really found my voice in my poetry. And it's poems often age after a while. You're like, oh, this is really cringe or whatever. But I still feel really proud of that poem to this day and sort of what it represents.
So speaking of Slamavision, can you just give us like a recap of what happened?
Yeah. So Slamavision is a global competition ran by UNESCO, Cities of Literature. So around the world, I think there's something like 46 cities that have been nominated by UNESCO to be recognised for their literary heritage. Nottingham is one of them, which is pretty cool. And because I was part of a poetry collective called Gobs, they put out this opportunity. And I had it in mind to do it, but I was sort of like, I'm not really feeling it, you know. And it literally got to the day of the deadline. And I was at a poetry show, and Bridie Squires, who runs Gobs Collective, this amazing local poet, she put out this, she just said to everyone, right, Slamavision's at closer tonight, submit your poetry, just do it. And I think she messaged me personally as well and was like, why haven't you submitted your poetry? And it was really just sort of like a why not thing. I didn't necessarily expect much to come out of it, and I just got my phone. My room was a mess, so I just threw some blankets over like a chair and sat in front of it and put a light on and just recorded this poem. And I think it was like the second take, and I was like, it's 11 o'clock, I'm going to bed, like send it through. And I just really had no expectation that I would get chosen to represent Nottingham at all. It was just sort of like there's nothing to lose sort of thing. So getting that email back was very shocking. And then obviously you go through to this whole process of it being this global competition and your video submitted and shared. And again, sort of being at the live show, I remember I think Hindenburg were one of the entries, and I was so sure they were going to win. I just thought I didn't even fully understand their poem, but it was just like so powerful. And it was very well shot and everything, and then mine was just like on an iPhone 7, like, so seeing those votes roll in was just like, I think I was at my auntie's house at the time, and we were both sat there just in shock, like just in disbelief.
What did you achieve after winning?
I think the biggest thing that came for me was just a sense of confidence. I think for a long time, like I mentioned, performance had felt like something that was just my weak point, sort of my Achilles heel in my creative process. I was like, I've never had any stage experience. I'm just kind of doing it the way that I think is right. And to kind of get that, not that you need validation from others, but sometimes just getting that external nod to be like, you're on the right track. It just gave me something, and I've held on to that ever since, sort of thing. And that's been really powerful for me, just navigating any spaces. I can kind of say, well, actually, like, I am a performer, and I owe it to myself to, go out there and do my best and stuff. And it's also just a cool thing to say.
Produce your poem, The Legend of the River Mama. When you first heard the folktale, how did you feel? What was your reaction?
It was this feeling of connection, I think. So I think I referenced it in the podcast, but for me, one of my biggest inspirations was a lady called Mrs. A. She was this incredible community elder. She lived into her 90s, and I think she was one of the first black nurses in the country. But she's also just like this incredible storyteller, and she kind of, for me, gave me this real interest in folk tales. And she would tell me sort of these ghost stories she used to tell as a child in the countryside. And so that kind of led me to sort of look into my own sort of stories and find out what else was out there. And I kind of stumbled on this River Mama tale. And it was just so cool. It was just like, this is so wild. And it was also, I think, just the fact that it's kind of emerged from sort of the stories of the enslaved community and everything, and those dynamics. The history was really interesting to me, and how it links all the way back to West African folk tales. So it was just a really rich story to me.
How did your mum influence your writing?
Ooh, good one. So my mum was actually, she didn't talk about it a lot, but she was quite a good writer herself. I think she was really great with sort of like a memoir style, so sort of just recounting her story or recounting the story of others. And towards the end of her life, she was actually attending creative writing sessions quite regularly. And some of the stuff she wrote was just so incredible. I'd love to sort of dig some of it up and share it and stuff. But I think my mum's influence just came from her passion to fight for and illuminate the stories and lives of the African Caribbean community. And she did that through specifically supporting people through their cancer journeys. So whether you had cancer yourself, whether you were impacted by cancer, she was one of the first black radiographers in the country, and one of the first to actually highlight inequalities and how sort of African Caribbean people with cancer were being treated. So she is essentially responsible for the fact that black people are called in earlier to be tested because we are more likely to be diagnosed earlier. She advocated for the diversification of food and hospital menus, so we can have something familiar when we go to hospital. She just recently posthumously won an award for a black hair project where a lot of black women were going to get wigs and stuff, and there were none that suited them. They were getting handed blonde straight wigs, obviously hugely unsettling experience for someone that's just lost their hair. Yeah. So she identified a need, and she, to the very end, up until 24 hours before she passed, was fighting for that need. And for me, that has just sort of infused my poetry in the sense that I see my poetry as an activist practice. I see it as capturing stories, honouring stories, talking on issues that need to be spoken about, and I kind of take that quite seriously with whatever I write. And that's just me, poetry is whatever it is to anybody, but for me it's impossible to separate it from that heritage. Yeah.
Are there any poems inspired about your mum? Yeah,
I really love to write poems about sort of maternal lines. Yeah. So my mum was one of 8, and 7 of them were girls. And then her mum had sisters, and just her mum, I think, was like a midwife. And there's just so many fascinating female characters in both sides. I think I had like a priestess of like a spiritual sort of tribe on my dad's side. And it's like, how can they not be in my poems, and how can they not be a focus for me? So it's just all the stories I've been told about them as well that sort of infused my poetry and still direct it to this day. And I think a lot about how things are passed down, and whether that's traumas that are passed down, whether that's talents that are passed down, they are sort of kind of a real focal point in my poetry. So yeah.
Everyone has a different meaning to poetry. What's yours?
God, what a question. Funny enough, I did a workshop on this a while ago called Poetry Is, and it was really interesting. People were coming up with all sorts of things. They were like, it's this, the smell of fresh earth, or like, very abstract things. I think for me, poetry is connection. I think I've just seen how incredible a bridge it can be between experience, especially with something like Slamavision, where I was talking, my poem spoke very specifically about this Black, British, Caribbean experience that I did not expect somebody in Melbourne or in Quebec or in Germany or Albania to connect with, but they still did. And that for me gave me so much more trust in people, in their ability to hold my stories and to hear me. And I don't think it's something that is necessarily as easily achieved through just conversation. Do you know what I mean? I think there's something about poetry that is so personal and so emotional, and that taps into something so communal, that you can't help but connect with somebody when they're that vulnerable with you. So I think it's a mixture of vulnerability and connection. Yeah.
Final question. What's your advice for aspiring poets or even people that want to get into poetry?
I think just start. And whether that's just starting in the privacy of your own bedroom, just getting the words onto the page, and also seeking out community. I think for me, my poetry journey really began when I found my poetry collective, when I found other writers with with similar interests, and the networking that goes on with that, the friendships that come out of that have been so invaluable. And it feels like a whole other family that you open yourself up to. And because you're all doing this work, you all recognise how much vulnerability it takes. And so with that, there comes a care inherently. So I'd say a mixture of just getting started and just sort of really trying to find that community that sort of speaks to you. And just having, utilising the things that are available to you. So social media platforms are very powerful for sort of connecting with people. Events that are going on in your city, if there's an open mic, give it a go. It's the perfect time to practice. You don't have to be perfect for an open mic. So things like that, it's just, it can be scary, but it's just, I think, if you just give it a go and see what happens, like that's what I would say.
Before we finish, me and the team would like to dedicate this interview to your mom.
Oh, so sweet. Thank you, guys. That's really kind.